Great. Welcome, everybody, wherever you are across the country, wherever you are in time and space, to the first meeting of our second opera book club of this season. We did George Bandt's Grounded earlier in the fall, and we're rounding out the season with a totally different work, Salome by Oscar Wilde. We're really thrilled today to be joined by Richard Kaye. Richard is a professor in the Department of English at Hunter College and in the PhD program in English at City University of New York. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago, where he did his bachelor's, and Princeton University, where he did his master's and PhD. And he has served for several years on the editorial staffs of The Nation and the New York Review of Books. His edited collection, this is the big update, the big news. His edited collection, The Picture of Dorian Gray in the 21st Century, New Essays on Oscar Wilde's classic novel, is forthcoming this year from Oxford University Press. And he told me just a few minutes ago, it's the first collection of essays on The Picture of Dorian Gray. So a major accomplishment. Who knows why it took so long, but maybe he can fill us in. And he has published widely on Wilde, including on Salome, which you can see a poster for Salome behind him in the back of his office, a picture of Salome with the severed head of John the Baptist. So his office is fully Salome out. Richard, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to talk with all of you. And I just saw the Met Opera's production last night, and I really loved it. And I think it's a triumph of Salomania, if you will.
Well, great. So I actually just want to ask you first, before we go into some of the history and context, for your take or your reaction to seeing Salome last night at the Met. I was also there. It was great as ever. What about this production? I know you've seen some other Salome productions at the Met or elsewhere. What makes this one special or especially interesting or worth really sort of biting into?
Well, this is the most psychologically rich Salome I've ever seen. There were so many nuances that I really admired the richness of the performances. The music was amazing. The singing was fantastic. What I especially, admired about this is, about 10 years ago, I wrote an essay on Salome, and I argued that there had been a neglected tradition in productions of Salome, and that was a tradition that stressed that Salome was a child. Mm-hmm. And I noted that most directors, whether it's in film or in opera, tended to see Salome as a femme fatale. Mm-hmm. You can see a good example of this in the Al Pacino film of Salome a few years ago with Jessica Chastain, mm-hmm. Playing Salome. Al Pacino both directed and starred as Herod in that. And that's a kind of classic approach to Salome, where she's this, scary femme fatale. And what I loved about the Met production is you were allowed to experience the childhood experience that propelled Salome into her depravity. Mm-hmm. And to me, that there's a kind of causality at the center of the Met's production, where you see a series of girl Salomes from child to adolescent who has been really traumatized by her experience of these venal adults. Mm-hmm. Herod, her mother Herodias. So she's a kind of pawn, and I think that that's very interesting and suggestive, as opposed to Salome productions where she's just this monster from the very beginning of the opera.
Yeah, and that's also, we've been talking about some tropes in opera, and one is, of course, the mad scene or the mad woman. And it's often the case that you don't really know why they're mad, or it just there's a switch that goes off and they go from being totally normal to then kind of going off the rails. And I like that you say there's a causality here, because the production has the effect of giving you backstory without spending time doing any kind of extra exposition. So it's a very clever staging in that way.
And to speak of the staging itself,
Mhm.
one way in which these ideas were telegraphed for me was um, this split stage where you have the top of the um, stage devoted to the social
Mhm.
world of the castle. It's very dark, and then you have the below ground dungeon like
Mhm.
area, all in white. And I started to, as I was watching the opera last night, I started to think of those two parts of the set in terms of the conscious self and the
Mhm.
unconscious self. So
Yeah.
Salome goes down below to indulge in her various depravities, and that that to me was to use a fancy word,
Mhm.
the concerns of the opera were spatialized
Mhm.
beautifully.
Mhm.
And I also liked, just to stay with this point for a moment, I liked that the whiteness of the lower area was not just a white purity, but actually it was kind of this strange, chalky,
Yeah.
dead space.
Kind of dust. It's almost like dirty, but still with a clean look. I don't know how to describe it, but it's dusty and chalky, but like there's residue. It's not just like a dentist office.
Yeah, exactly. It was not sterile and it was not clean,
Mhm.
Will. And so I admired, I mean, the visual dimension to the Mets production. I just there was I couldn't I kept finding things to look at.
Mhm.
And often that's not the case with opera for me. I sort of, there's the set,
Mhm.
and okay, and we're with, Tosca and
Mhm.
Costello, and but here there was a constant visual palette that I was drawn to. So there's the music, the visuals, the
Mhm.
singing. It was kind of overwhelming, actually.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not someone who gets overwhelmed by operas that much, but um, and also it's worth saying that it's easy to do Salome as camp, and
Mhm.
I think camp can be great. You get that in that movie Salome's Last Dance, but this was a grave Salome. It
Mhm.
was sort of the opposite of camp, actually.
Yeah, I love that point about the way space in the production seems to correspond to Salome's psychological terrain, whatever. And so when she's going down, she's actually sort of plumbing the depths of her own psyche, her own consciousness. And it occurs to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you know better. But in the play, my memory is that she asks for Yohannahan to be brought out of the cellar, and he sort of crawls out or is brought up to her to the surface where she is in the palace. And in this production, she very explicitly goes down to see him in the tomb or the cellar
Yeah.
rather than him being brought up. And so that kind of correlation between going down to see him and going down into a different level of her consciousness or herself is sort of works in a way. And that's a staging direction, not that's not in the text of the play, if I recall.
That's absolutely right. And most productions of the opera, the Strauss opera, they often like are cranking him up so he comes
Mhm.
up from below, and
Mhm.
it's whereas this, I think she is, by the time she's going down to confront John the Baptist, Yochanan, she's really an agent of her perverse sexual desire. So it makes a kind of sense that she
Mhm.
kind of corner him down there, um, and um, and I can't, I don't want to. I'm not a musicologist, but I
Mhm.
can't stress enough the uniqueness of the music and its disturbing newness at that. The New Yorker music critic Alex Ross has a wonderful history of 20th century music,
Mhm.
and he does something important. Whereas most histories of 20th century music that I've read begin with Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps, the Rite of
Mhm.
Spring, 1913.
13. Mhm.
Yeah, and because there were riots,
Right.
right, and the music was so disturbing that different parts of the audience were fighting it out. But um, Alex Ross thinks that really the beginning of discordant modern music begins with Strauss's opera, and adding to the power of that moment in music history, we're pretty sure that the composer, another great modernist composer, Schoenberg,
Mhm.
was at one of the early
Yes,
performances.
I think the Dresden premiere, something like that.
Or
Yes.
maybe the one after Dresden. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful anecdote that I want to share with you that
Sure.
I about the rehearsal for the Dresden performance. I heard this anecdote from the late musicologist and pianist Charles Rosen, and
Mhm.
the story goes that Strauss was at the rehearsal, and the soprano playing Salome started to get during the rehearsal a little too. She started to swing the paper mache head of John the Baptist around too violently and
Mhm.
ostentatiously, and Strauss stopped the rehearsal and he said, "Please, please, my dear, stop doing that. The music is disgusting enough." So, this awareness on the part of Strauss that he's got this score that's going to upset people, I
Yeah.
think, is captured in this anecdote, and it is just it's incredibly beautiful music, but
Mhm.
it's also jarring by 19th century standards, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll just add my own sort of reaction or perspective on the score, which is to go on this point of the upstairs, we'll call it, of the palace of Herod and Herodias and the servants and Salome, and the downstairs of the dungeon cellar with Yochanan. If you listen and think about the space in this Met production specifically, all the stuff happening in the palace is to me the most discordant, grotesque, avant-garde music. And the stuff that Yochanan is getting is the most sort of triumphant, almost transcendently beautiful brass, because he's a man of God. He's heralding the coming of this new era, this new person. And so his music is so beautiful. And then you get back upstairs and it's back to
Yeah.
um, the whatever kind of obscenities are happening, obscenities are happening in that palace. So it's the mapping of the upstairs and the downstairs works visually and also psychologically and also musically in a way that's really effective.
Yeah, I think that's right. And part of the discordance of the upper world
Mhm.
is that um, dress that Herodias is wearing, which is
Mhm.
it's this strange red orange color. I don't know. It's like
Yes.
a mixture of the blood and the sun, and
Mhm.
something really there's something really disturbing in that. One point I want to make about the story of Salome, it's easy to focus on her depravity,
Mhm.
her necrophilic lust, but the great Wilde scholar Richard Ellman once made a really important point about Salome. I'm just going to read this to you
Sure.
about the play, but I think it's hold true for the opera. And he writes, in Salome, the page boy loves the Syrian soldier. The
Mhm.
Syrian soldier and Herod love Salome.
Mhm.
Salome loves John the Baptist. John the Baptist loves Jesus.
Mhm.
All love appears as deviation, and no deviation is superior to any other. All bring their tragic consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that description because I think there is a kind of round robin of um, obsession that's
Yeah.
all characters share, and that's what's so disturbing about Wilde's play and Strauss's opera.
Yeah, and I love that point because there's everybody is going first is interested in looking at someone. Um, and it's important to remember that Salome gets the way that she gets downstairs, let's say, is by sort of seducing Narabat and saying, I'll wave to you tomorrow, if you let me see Yucanahan. So for Narabat, he's getting closer to Salome by letting her get closer to Yucanahan. So everybody is trying to get closer to some person on stage, even if that's by going through someone else. So yeah, you're right that it's not just this, it's not even a triangle. It's like a hexagon or
Yeah,
who knows what, some kind of weird geometry.
I don't know if I could diagram it, but
Yeah.
I guess I would use the word round robin. Like
Yeah.
it's and then the other interesting point I think is that this I'm extrapolating from what you just said, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of bargaining
Mm-hmm.
going on in Salome.
Yeah.
You do this for me, I'll do this for you, and I think we're allowed to see in this production a complicated Salome the character. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
she's innocent, she's abused daughter, she's bargaining sort of like a prostitute, if you will, like do this for me and I'll do this for you. And I think that's true to the original source, Wilde's play. There's a moment in Wilde's play where Salome is both innocent and depraved. And I think the line is something like, I do not know why my stepfather looks at me this way. Beat. In truth, I know all too well.
Mm-hmm.
That simultaneity of innocence and knowledge is, I think, central to Wilde and Strauss's Salome.
Yeah, it's almost like she knows too much for how young she is. She shouldn't have to know too much. And maybe it's that she's learned how to bargain because she's been in this household.
Yeah.
And so she's sort of using the tools that have been used on her. I want to zoom out broad picture and ask, if for someone who maybe hasn't read much Oscar Wilde or only knows Dorian Gray or The Importance of Being Earnest, what for Wilde is the impulse to write Salome, and why is he writing in French when he's not French? And this is the one thing he decides to write in French. Where does that come from?
Well, that's a really good question, and some of it is related to the picture of Dorian Gray, actually, which he, had written previously. And when the picture of Dorian Gray came out, it got mostly scathing reviews in Britain and America, but in France, they loved it.
Mm.
And so he increasingly identified as French in spirit over time. And you can see that all over the place. For example, Wilde hated Charles Dickens.
Mm-hmm.
He loved Balzac,
mm-hmm.
Mallarmé. And so I think it's an attempt at identifying with France and French culture. And so that's one thing that's going on. Exactly why he chose Salome, we're not sure, but he loved the icons and the imagery and of religion and Christianity. Mm-hmm. He once said of Christianity, it's a beautiful lie.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, really wants to reanimate this relatively minor story in the Gospels.
Yeah. I think it's like one line or something.
It's one line, yeah. And he, and of course, this is this is the reason Salome doesn't get produced in Britain for some time, because there was a ban in Britain on religious subjects on the stage, and you couldn't have a religious play on the British stage. And so by time Salome is produced in Paris, Wilde is in jail. He's in prison.
Right.
And I think there's the main the other thing I would say about Salome, one reason that she attracts Wilde is she shares certain affinities with Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray cares about beauty above all else. Salome goes on and on about Yochanan's hair, his lips, his skin. So it's Dorian, I'm calling him by his first name because I'm actually familiar with him. Dorian and Salome are both, they're sort of beauty obsessed hedonists, and Wilde gives them, this should be the subject for discussion, he gives them tragic fates. Though I think it was interesting with the Met production, we don't actually see Salome killed. She kind of, sorry, that's a little bit of a spoiler alert. Spoiler.
She sort of disappears into the fog, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, does she go on to find other saints she can hang out with? Does she go off? My read of it was she goes off into myth. So I loved, this really speaks to what I love about the Met's production. Every moment when a lesser director would have given a literal meaning, I think Klaus Guth, is it Guth? Yeah.
Yeah.
Klaus Guth goes for a symbolic, a non-realistic, a non-literal interpretation. And that is so true to Oscar Wilde, who hated realism and who loved symbol and magic and the imagination. And so that Salome disappears that way into that mist is a really original way to end the opera.
Yeah, and it occurs to me when you say Dorian and Salome are both people who love beauty and find tragic fates, that to me sounds like Wilde. I mean, as you know, not to say that he knew that, maybe he did, but there is that thread through. You mentioned Zalomania briefly, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what happens after Wilde publishes Salome, and what its sort of immediate legacy is, or what happens in its wake as soon as it is published in the 1910s.
It's a very rich history after Wilde. Obviously, the most important is Strauss. And by the way, to go back to your question about Wilde, there is a bigger mystery around why Strauss chose Salome. I mean, we know that we don't really have a clear sense, other than that Strauss's operas typically have very strong female characters. But it becomes part of not just high opera, the operatic repertory, but Salome becomes popular in pop culture. So in I think it's the 40s, there's a movie with Rita Hayworth playing Salome. You get in the 20s and 30s and 40s female dancers who only perform the Dance of the Seven Veils, and it becomes a very popular dance, and quite separate from Wilde and Strauss's versions of Salome. And then you get it coincides with a shift in dance, really, where you get figures like Loie Fuller, dancers, Loie Fuller, Ida Rubinstein, Isadora Duncan, women who want to make their own choreography. And
Mhm.
Salome gives that opportunity with the Dance of the Seven Veils, which, im- important to say, um, it's we're in the world of high opera, but we have this supposedly trashy thing of a striptease.
Right, right.
That's pretty remarkable. So one way to think about Salome, Wilde's play, and Strauss's opera is to think about them as erasing the boundaries between high art and popular and low art.
Mhm.
I think it's a crucial engine of a kind of a new sense of what performance is.
Mhm.
And then I also think it's worth thinking of Salome as um, she's, among other things, a consumer. She's like fat. She wants to, she demands, like the spoiled child she is,
Yeah.
that she get this thing and she wants to possess it. And it's a very disturbing take on, in my view,
Mhm.
an emerging consumer culture, if you
Mhm.
will.
Mhm.
Um, so that's part of the legacy, and then we can see Salome in various film adaptations.
Mhm.
One of the directors whose Salome opera, version of Salome, I like is the Canadian filmmaker Adam Agoyan.
Mhm.
Did a version of Salome in 1996 in Toronto,
Mhm.
and he was quite an innovator. And he projected onto the stage video home movies, he called them, of Salome's childhood.
Interesting.
And that was really one of the very first uses of film in opera that
Mhm.
I'm aware of. I think, and then Adam Agoyan, the rest of his film career, he's obsessed with Salome. And just this past year, he directed a movie called Seven Veils, which is about an actress a singer rather, who's
Mhm.
obsessed with a Salome performance she did a number of years before.
Mhm.
So that's a short, abbreviated 20 and 21st century history of Salome adaptation.
Yeah, and it reminds me, I was with a friend last night at the opera, and he mentioned Sunset Boulevard, which, the movie from 1950, Billy Wilder, and of course the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, is about a woman who, in order to stage her comeback, says, "I'm gonna be Salome." It's like the role is, it has this mythic legacy that people can use it to make their stamp or make their mark. And so it's not just, the what the play is, but how Salome is seen by audiences. And it's almost like an opportunity to walk into that role and make it your own in some way. But it has that kind of almost glamour. I don't know if that's the right. Um,
Yeah, I think that is the right word. And of course, I don't want to give away the story of Sunset Boulevard, but
yeah, it doesn't
what
end well.
another
Yeah,
spoiler,
yeah.
her own life is mimics Salome's in the worst way,
Hmm.
in terms of how that ending, and how that movie ends.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
glamour is a good word for it. And there too, I think there are links with Dorian Gray. I I think that the big mistake in in so many productions of Salome and Dorian Gray
Hmm.
is to judge these characters
Hmm.
without recognizing, at least for a while, the glamour
Hmm.
that they bring to their stories. I mean, it's a it's it's I think it's Wilde is very ambivalent about both Dorian Gray and Salome. I mean, he sort of, otherwise, why would he kill them off?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why would he kill them off?
I want to ask you about the last line of the opera, which you noted is changed somewhat in the way that the Met is translating what is ultimately the German, which is a translation of the French. And so, can you talk a little bit about just how
Yeah.
we've already spoiled the ending that she walks off into the mist? So,
Yeah.
with that said,
Yeah. Well, Wilde's play and most adapt most of the Strauss productions end with Herod's line, "Kill that woman."
mhm,
Almost as if Herod is now siding with John the Baptist and being
mhm,
a moralist, right?
mhm,
Like, you're a bad girl. But the Met production, and I think this is utterly right, given the conception of the Klauska's conception, the last line is, "Kill that girl,"
mhm,
which actually is a much more shocking sentence after all, right?
mhm,
Because you're killing a child, you're
mhm,
killing a girl, you're not killing a depraved woman, and so
right,
I think it's chilling. It's really
mhm,
chilling, and and it's, you know, it's a really interesting um, shift. One reason I want to get this in before we finish.
mhm,
One reason there's a lot of interest in Salome at the beginning of the 20th century is Wilde's play, Strauss's opera, both coincide with Sigmund Freud's new
mhm,
conception of childhood. You know, Freud comes along with various essays and books, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, where he shocks a 19th century and early 20th century public by saying children have erotic fantasies, they have a complicated, troubled psychic inner life. And we need to be aware of this if we're going to have a healthy society. And this is so shocking that in one of Freud's books, Dora, which is a case study of one of his patients,
mhm,
the English translators working from the German, um, the translator James Strachey, who's British, he knows that this theory is going to be disturbing. And so, where Freud clearly called Dora, that's the subject of the case
mhm,
study, Dora, where Freud clearly called her a woman, in his English translation, James Strachey changed it to girl.
mhm,
And it's just a real, you know, a real attempt to protect Freud from the charge that, you know, he was thinking about children in a shameful and shocking way. And I think that lends a lot of interest to Salome, the psychoanalytic, the Freudian understanding of childhood. The dates line up almost like exactly. Freud's coming out with, I think, Dora's, the case study is like 1902. So there's a lot going on in the culture. And after all, it's worth remembering that the idea of the adolescent is a relatively new idea at the beginning of the 20th century. It's
mhm,
just starting to come to be constructed, if you will, to use
mhm.
the term. And so that gives added resonance to the Strauss opera. Um, we're being asked to think of a child, an adolescent, a young woman in a shocking new way, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and it's hard when you're seeing an opera and nobody on the stage, typically, except for the dancers in this particular production, when no one on the stage is necessarily the age of the character they're playing, it's hard to remember seeing the Strauss opera that Salome is a teenager. It's the same when we see Madama Butterfly. and we forget that she's 15 or 16 years old. It's just not something you can do with an opera. So I think you're right that this production is helpful in reminding us through all these other iterations of Salome that everyone will see this weekend, that she is in fact a child, and the change from woman to girl helps remind us at the very end that what we've been seeing all along is not two adults having a disagreement. It's actually a man and a young girl. And that is as jarring as anything else that happens on stage.
I think that's right. And I will say that the soprano, Elsa Vandenhever, was such an expert, not just an expert singer, but the way she sort of used her body. I forgot that this is a 40-year-old woman. Like, I started to believe in her as a young woman, and it was just captivating. I seldom see an opera singer take advantage of the body, if you will, and not just the voice in the way that she did. It was quite stunning. I was convinced that this was a young woman.
Yeah, there's lots of playful movement and almost kind of hopscotching and skipping and using bodily gesture in a way that was very childlike, for lack of a better word. Elsa's an amazing actress, so it's just cool to see her on stage and doing sort of like the most difficult role in the soprano repertoire while acting like a teenager. It's very at odds with itself, let's say.
I think it's fairly well known in the opera world that Salome is a very demanding part. And it allows for really wonderful, creepy innovations. I saw a Salome some years ago in the opera, and when the actress is kissing John the Baptist's lips, kind of gurgles, as you can hear this gurgling as if she's having this palpable bodily reaction to his lips. So there's a lot of room in the opera for innovation, and the Metz production had so many wonderful creepy things. I mean, I have to say I was really disturbed in a kind of horror movie way, like by the length of time we had to look. Sorry, a little bit of a spoiler here.
That's okay.
But the headless corpse of John the Baptist, he's just there on the stage for a creepily long amount of time.
Yeah.
And it's no longer just a head being moved around. It's like two parts of a body.
Right. And that's it reminds me of when we spoke earlier about the fact that Salome actually goes down into the cellar in this production. I feel like in most productions, or at least historical photos I've seen, archival photos of previous productions at the Met and elsewhere, the head is brought to Salome on a platter, right, as she asks. And so it's just the disembodied head, and she's gazing upon it and talking to it, but the body is nowhere to be seen. In this production, because she goes down, she gets the head and you see the headless body. So it makes it that much more kind of grotesque and eerie, because you actually see the violence in a more kind of literal, physical way.
Yeah, but I will. You just reminded me, Nick, that there is some humor in this.
There is. You're right.
For example, you're reminding me when she says very dramatically, "I want it on a silver tray." All of a sudden, like 5 servants show up with 5 silver trays, as if like they just happen to have them around for her, and they're eager to satisfy her. And I have to say, I giggled when that happened. It just seemed kind of funny to see suddenly all these silver trays produced.
Exactly. And there are other funny moments that I hope will get caught on camera for the live in HD screening, where Herodias she just taps on the wall, and a white glove appears and pours her more champagne. and she just keeps doing it over the course of the entire opera, so she's getting drunker and drunker. So there are these moments of levity, even if it's just a sort of minor chuckle before something else horrible happens.
I think that's exactly right, and I didn't think about it till now, but Herodias is used comically in this production. She's like a glamorous drunk, and and she's obviously has to deal with her husband being obsessed with her daughter. So who can blame her for drinking? Like it's almost there too. We have a clear causality. Like it's and by the way, I in talking about the history of Salome in the 20th century, I neglected to mention the very rich visual history of Salome's, and I'm thinking of the Salome's by the wonderful symbolist French painter Gustave Moreau, whose studio is now a museum in Paris, and he was obsessed with Salome. And there's a really fascinating Pablo Picasso Salome that I would encourage people to Google and look online, which is, I think, the year of this, or very close to the year of Strauss's opera. And I think it's an etching, but there's a lot of attention to Salome in painting and drawing over, particularly in the early part of the 20th century.
Well, I think we're just about at time. Thank you again, Richard, for being with us and lending us some of your Wildean expertise and helping us make sense of this very strange book that is sort of unlike anything I've read and unlike anything I've seen. So thank you again for your time, and we look forward to the Live in HD screening of Strauss this weekend on May 17th, and we hope we'll see you soon.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.